I'm very happy to share with you another video from one of our astrological apprenticeship students. This video comes from Fernando Raul Castro, who's been participating in the astrological apprenticeship program for many years, and as of this recording is just about done with that training. For students of the astrological apprenticeship program, after they complete all of the coursework, it is important that they demonstrate what they've learned. So when individuals make it to the end, they have to do a certain number of sessions with clients that are recorded and feedback is given. They're required to write 3 10,000 word papers over the course of a year with a topic of their choice. And they're also required to create 3 presentations, an hour in length, to be posted on YouTube. Number one, so that we can see that they're able to communicate clearly and to demonstrate some of the knowledge that they have learned over the course of their study. So, without wasting any more time, I'd like to introduce to you, or reintroduce to you, Fernando Raul Castro and his discussion class on the Nakshatras.
Hello. My name is Fernando Raul Castro Alvarez, and I am an astrologer, or at least I think it would better be said I am a student of astrology at Fernando Raul Astrology. And today I'm making this video to talk to you about the astronomical references to the Nakshatras in the Vedic astrology of India, of Jyotisha. And what we're going to do in this video is that we're going to talk about the astronomical references, or the yoga taras associated to the 27 or 28 nakshatras in Jyotisha. You know, on YouTube, we usually see sidereal Vedic astrologers talk a lot about stars. We also see tropical Vedic astrologers talk a lot about stars. A lot of astrologers talk about stars from whatever school of astrology they are. But, you know, siderealists usually spend a lot of time emphasizing the importance of the stars in terms of creating the sidereal zodiac, in terms of studying the nakshatras. But to my knowledge and in my experience, we seldom see videos of these astrologers talk about the stars, talk about the yoga taras that relate either to the signs or specifically to the nakshatras. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to talk about stars. And remember, there are 3 main ways through which you can learn astrology. Number 1 is through books, which is basically how the majority of us start. Autodidactically, we buy books, we go to blogs, we watch videos, we listen to podcasts, and slowly but surely we start getting our feet wet into the world of astrology. The second way is through a guru, which the guru is gonna transmit his knowledge, his wisdom, and his experience, but most of all his parampara, his lineage towards us. And he's obviously gonna use books, he's obviously gonna use videos, and so on and so forth. And the third way to learn astrology is through astronomy, is through visual astronomy, mathematical astronomy, theoretical astronomy, physical astronomy, and so on and so forth. So before we start, I want to suggest to you that please go out and watch the stars. Because when you watch the stars, you're going to learn a lot about the stars. And with this video, you're going to learn a lot about the stars that are specifically related to each of the nakshatras. Okay? So before we start, we have to remember that there is a reality that goes on in the astrological world. As you know, astronomy and astrology became divorced more or less by the 17th, 18th century. There was a great divorce. In ancient times, astronomers were astrologers and astrologers were astronomers. And as you know today, you know, respected academic astronomers think very lowly of astrologers. For them, astrologers are terminally ill, crazy people who believe in pseudoscience. That is very well known in the astrological community. However, seldom do we talk about the reality that most astrologers do not want to go into the world of astronomy. Most of the astrologers do not want to read books. Most of astrologers are very scared of math. very scared of numbers. But you have to remember that Jyotisha is a science of light. Astrology is a science and an art. And the scientific basis of astrology is its mathematical and astronomical components, which are obligatory to create good astrology. It is the basis from which the spiritual and the astrologistic side of astrology comes forth. So we have to be aware of principle and simple astronomical precepts to understand more deeply our astrological practice. Now, that being said, it's very important to review certain terms that we're going to use along this video. First of all, what are nakshatras? Nakshatras are basically 27 equal parts or segments of the ecliptic that are superimposed over the 12 zodiac signs that we know. You can look at it at the from the other side. You can look at it that the 12 signs are superimposed over the 27 equal parts. You can look at it however you want. Now, nakshatras can be 27 or 28. We're going to talk about that later on, but the idea is that it's 27 equal parts, which are subdivided into 13 degrees and 20 minutes of arc all along the ecliptic. Okay, and basically it is a subdivision of the firmament in relation of the rotation of the moon to the earth from a geocentric point of view. And basically it is just the division of the sky in terms of the rotation of the moon. Yes, there is a solar component, especially in Vedic astrology with all the Panchanga stuff, Titis, Karanas, the Panchanga yogas, and so on and so forth. But basically that is the simple definition of nakshatras. But in essence, nakshatras, what they are lunar mansions. Basically, the subdivision of the sky in terms of the rotation of the moon. Now, you can measure the lunar month in many ways, but usually the way they measure it in Vedic astrology is a sidereal lunar month, which is basically 27.3. 27.3 days, 27 nakshatras within the Vinshottari scheme of 9 planetary heralds and 108 padas. But we're going to talk about that later on. The idea is that nakshatras are lunar mansions within Jyotisha. But a lot of astrologers do not talk about this fact. Lunar mansions exist on other astrologies. They exist on Chinese astrologies, and they are called Shu, and they exist in Arab or Muslim or Persian astrology, and they are called mansils there. So nakshatras are not unique to Vedic astrology. They are unique within the Vedic context. They are unique within the Vedic lore that is intrinsically related to those nakshatras in terms of deities, in terms of their qualities, and in terms of all the jataka or natal astrology techniques associated to them. But lunar mansions exist on other astrologies. Now, the question is, if they exist on other astrologies, which was the original nakshatra, the original lunar mansions? Well, that's a historical question that is up for grabs, but it very probably originated within Vedic astrology, but it originated in a very crude form, not necessarily as part of a natal astrology, more of an electional astrology. Now, some people say that originally it was more from the Chinese side, but I don't think so, because they were first 24, then they were 28. Obviously, the Muslims are not the first, because they developed after, at least after the 8th century AD, so that's very well ahead of the Vedic civilization, which is much older. So in essence, we can say to a degree that the nakshatras per se, not as they are used within natal astrology, but the nakshatras per se were originally from India, and they originally had a sort of muhurta purpose to it. They had, in essence, in the beginning, a purpose to celebrate ceremonies, to celebrate sacrifices according to the Vedic lore. And we have to remember that Jyotisha is a Vedanga, and it's the last Vedanga in terms of arranging time systems and calendars, not necessarily to talk about natal astrology. That probably came afterwards, when horoscopic astrology of the Hellenistic civilization came into contact with the Indian astrology, more or less after the 2nd and 3rd century AD, at the soonest. Okay, so basically that is nakshatra. There are two systems of nakshatra. One is 27 stars, one is 28 stars, and we're going to talk about that later on. But the idea is that nakshatras are lunar mansions where we subdivide the path of the moon around the earth from a sidereal perspective, which is once again 27.3 days. Now, how do we identify the nakshatras? Where they're usually identified through a starting point, which usually is Ayanamsha. And you can choose any Ayanamsha you want. It can be the galactic center, it can be Lahir, whatever you want. But the idea is that if you want to measure nakshatras in terms of padas to a mathematical precision, you have to measure the zodiac from the beginning place where you are fixing the sidereal stars. Now, there is another way to figure out in what nakshatra a Taragraha or the moon is. And by Taragraha, I mean the starry planets of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and obviously the moon. You cannot see specifically where the sun is by simple sight because when the sun is out, there are no stars. But the starry grahas and the moon, you can locate it in the firmament by seeing where it is. And that's where the astronomical references to nakshatra come in. And they are called yoga tara. Yoga in Sanskrit means union. And usually yogas in Vedic astrology are associated to these arrangements by conjunctions or aspects that create results. But in essence, it's just a union. And tara means star. So through the astronomical references of the nakshatras or the yoga taras, when you see a planet in transit or when you see a planet when you are racing a natal chart when someone is born, you can more or less, and I have to emphasize that more or less, identify in what nakshatra a planet is by seeing where it is united with a specific tara, yoga tara. Okay, so basically what we're going to discuss in this video is that we're going to go yoga tara by yoga tara or astronomical reference by astronomical reference to see what stars allude to what nakshatras. And you have to remember the most important nakshatra in any natal chart is always the lunar nakshatra. Is always the nakshatra of the moon or the so-called Janma nakshatra or the nakshatra of birth, which alludes to the nakshatra where your natal moon is. Why? Because the Janma nakshatra, the natal moon nakshatra, will anchor your chart or any chart in question into space and time. Because that Janma Nakshatra will identify what time periods of a lunar nature will apply to you, and at the same time, it will determine when time periods start and when time period ends. We have to remember that nakshatras are not necessarily primarily natal astrological symbols. There are more or less little flags of time that set up different segments of the ecliptic to align different time periods that will apply or not apply depending on certain astrological arrangements. So you have to take out of your mind the idea that nakshatras are like signs, because they are not. This has come to be because of an oversimplification in the Vedic astrology pedagogy throughout the last 40 years. There are a lot of myths related to nakshatras, and we're going to talk about them a little bit in this video. But the idea is that nakshatras are basically timestamps. They're basically time flags. And you know how to arrange them because of the natal moon. And that is the principal nature that nakshatras have in a natal chart, because originally they were used for electional astrology in order to know when to do a sacrifice, when to do a ceremony from the Vedic perspective. Okay? So basically, this is what you have to have in mind, because today, the majority of astrologers, in addition to the idea that they don't want to get into astronomy, they also have these fabulous tools, right? These fabulous tools of the computer software where you have thousands of calculations done in very few seconds. Now, ancient astrologers did not have these tools, so they had to obligatorily rely on to visual, physical calculations. Now they had tools. They weren't, it wasn't so rudimentary that they just use their eyesights. There were always rulers, tables. There were probably always, from a long time ago, ephemerides to a certain degree. Not the modern ones that we have, but they had some sort of charts to a certain degree. But the idea is that by this technique of identifying the yogataras with the nakshatras, there comes this snapshot technique of knowing where a planet is in terms of its nakshatra positions by its union to the yogatara assigned to that nakshatra, but once again, more or less. And you see this also with other techniques in Vedic astrology. For example, the famous, Graha Drishni technique for Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars, the idea that Jupiter aspects 5, 7, and 9, that Saturn aspects 3, 7, and 10, and that what else? That Mars aspects 4, 7, and 8. That's not true, because Graha Drishtis are percentual aspects that have to be measured mathematically and geometrically to know the exact percentage. But these were just fast snapshot techniques that astrologers use to measure transits. Well, this technique that I'm going to illustrate to you in terms of showing you the taragrahas that are associated to the nakshatras, you will be able to identify the planets in transits by associating the nakshatra to the star with which they are conjunct in the sky. Although that is not necessarily the correct term, it's more or less where they are united, right? Because this is basically Gola. This is basically visual astronomy in Sanskrit. This is basically, to a certain degree, lower class Ganita, lower class Vedic astronomy. So let's step right in and let's start seeing the graphics and start this video about the yogataras, or the astronomical references to the nakshatras. So we're going to start first with the master map. I did this map. So let's start from the basics. This is a stellar map. As you can see, there are a lot of constellations here. These are the majority of the constellations that you will see in the night sky. Officially today, the astronomical societies of the world recognize at least 88 official constellations. You won't see the 88 here, but more or less you see the most important ones. Now, I want you to go to the vertical axis where you see the degrees. You see in the middle 0 degrees, and then you go up to 70 and down to 70. Up is north and down is south, okay? And you see that wavy line in the middle that has little spaces in between? That is basically the ecliptic. That is the apparent path of the sun in relation to the earth from a geocentric perspective. Now, the sun will always be in this line. It kind of moves a little bit, but it's very small movement, but the sun will always be here. It will not falter from this line. That is why it will move 1 degree in 1 day. That's why you have 360 days, 360 degrees, one perfect circle, which in antique times, in old times, in traditional times, was a traditional year. But with time, humanity developed a better calendar, and we figured out it was 365 days and a little bit more. So basically, that's how we measure time, and that's basically the path of the sun. Now, the lower wave is basically when the sun is in the southern part of the ecliptic in the Tropic of Capricorn, and in the upper wave, it's basically when the sun it's in its northernmost part of the ecliptic, which is the Tropic of Cancer, that allude both to the constellation of Cancer and Capricorn. So basically, you have the sun. Now, the planets also travel through this line, right? They go forward, backwards, up, and down. And that's where you have zodiacal longitude and zodiacal latitude. When planets are direct, they go forward. When planets go retrograde, they go back. Obviously, the sun and the moon do not do that, but all the other planets do. So basically, you have the zodiacal degrees that measure zodiacal longitude, right? In terms of forward or backwards, right? And then also planets go up and down this line, not the sun, just the planets and the moon. And they more or less go 9 or 8 degrees north and 9 or 8 degrees south, okay? And basically, that's where you have zodiacal latitude in terms of up and down that line. And basically, you have, from a geocentric point of view, the transits of the planets that go along this ecliptic, right? And you can subdivide that ecliptic into equal parts, 12 equal parts, and have a zodiac. And you can do it sidereally or you can do it tropically. And you can also do it astronomically, but you're going to have asymmetrical sections, and you're going to have 13 because of the constellation of Ophiuchus. So basically, this is how you read this map. Now, south of the ecliptic are constellations, right? And north of the ecliptic are constellations. The constellations that are very in the south of the map are only seen in the southern hemisphere, and constellations that are very up in the map are only seen in the northern hemisphere. So basically, if you look at my image now, you have to imagine seeing this like this, right? And the planets go up and down and all that, right? So basically, the majority of the stars in the upper part are gonna be seen from the northern hemisphere, and the majority of the south, very south, are gonna be seen in the southern hemisphere. Now, different epochs of the year are going to facilitate or impede seeing certain stars depending on the station we're in, be it fall, be it winter, be it spring or summer, depending on the solstices or equinoxes where we are, because that will show the inclination of the earth in relation to the sun, to where we can see and we cannot see, okay? So basically, I kind of explained this map. It's a very traditional map. Now let's go to the points. Basically, these red points that I've written here allude to the Yogataras, which are basically the astronomical references for each of the nakshatras. And as you can see, I've written down 28 points. And basically, we start from 1 and we end in 27. Now, the order that I chose is the order that is mostly used today. We have to remember that there are basically 2 orders of nakshatra. One is the one that the majority of astrologers know, that start with Ashwini and end with Revati. But there's another older system that started with Kritika and ended with Bharani, okay? But basically, let's just review the different points. Number 1, which you will see in the right part of the map, is basically Ashwini. Number 2 is Bharani. Number 3 is Kritika. Number 4, Rohini. Number 5, Mirashira. Number 6, Ardra. Number 7, Punarvasu. Number 8, Pushya. Number 9, we have obviously Ashlesha. 10, Maga. 11, 12, the Falgunis. 13, Hasta. 14, Chitra. 15, Swati. 16, Vishaka. 17, Anuradha. 18, Yeshta. 19, Mula. 20 and 21, the Ashadas. 22, Shravana. 23, Danishta. 24, we have Shatabishak. 25 and 26, see, they're in opposite sides because that's where the map ends and starts. 25 and 26 are the Bhadrapadas, and 27 is Revati. Now, go to number 28, which is in the left upper corner, 28 with the orange circle. Basically, you have there Abhijit. And look at it, it's pretty up north. And we're going to talk about the thing with Abhijit later on when we talk about its Yogatara. So basically, this is the map. This is the whole map. You can download this image from my Instagram. Just look up Astronomy of the Nakshatras hashtag, or you can look it up in my page in Facebook. But, you know, this is a map that is seldom shown in its entirety when we talk about the nakshatras. And I think it's very important because the Yogataras will help you learn more about the nakshatras. Now, before we continue and we go star by star, the question inevitably arises. Where did these stars come from, right? Where did this idea come from that these are the stars that allude to these specific nakshatras? So we have to remember, first of all, that there are very little written text in relation to the nakshatras. You obviously have the Atharva Veda reference, where basically it's, if I'm not mistaken, it was in, where was it? It was in book 19 in hymn 17, if I'm not, no, in book 19 in hymn 7, you basically have that reference to the nakshatras. Now, that's basically from 1000 BC, although some people might say it's much older than that. But basically, that's one of the earliest references to the nakshatras. Now, you will notice that in that references, you won't have astronomical Yogataras for the nakshatras. Now, the other references the Taitriya Brahmana. There's another Taitriya book that talk about the nakshatras. You won't see astronomical references. The other references to the nakshatras in terms of where they are, I mean, there are not a lot in terms of finding out where they come from. But at the same time, you have Vedanga Jyotisha or Jyotisha Vedanga, which is a book that talks about the nakshatras, and there you will see the deities without a doubt. But Vedanga Jyotisha is a book that really talks more about the subdivisions of time, and they talk about the yugas, and they talk about time periods, titis, muhurtas, and all that. But they do talk about the deities, which is very important. And that book is not really know when it was written. You know, the dating is pretty bad. So as you can see, there aren't a lot of reference to the nakshatras per se, and they're like murky. Because, you know, Atharva Veda, it's basically the academic community will say 1000 BC, but a lot of other people will say it's much older. That Taitriya Brahmana is sooner than that. And basically you have the Vedanga Jyotisha, which people fluctuate from 1,000 years. But none of these books really talk about the Yogataras. You really don't get to the Yogataras until you get to Varahamihira, which probably was the most important astronomer, astrologer of Vedic lore. He's basically like the Ptolemy or the Vitius Valens of Vedic astrology. Or the Mashallah of Vedic astrology, if you will. Basically, in the 6th century, he kind of gave these references through the Surya Siddhanta, which is basically a very important astronomical book in Vedic astrology. And he also wrote the Brihad Jataka, where you have the first allusion to the moon by nakshatra in terms of natal results. And you will only see that 2 times in the classics, one with Brihad Jataka and the other one with Jataka Parijata, which was written 900 years after that. But basically in Surya Siddhanta is where you have the Yogataras for the nakshatras. But then you also have Yogataras in later astronomical books like Siddhanta, Siromani, Graha Lagava, also Brahma Siddhanta. And also you have some allusions from Muslim astrology by the astrologer Al-Biruni through a book he calls Kanka Kalaka, which sometimes is not referred to it by its original Vedic name. But usually that's where you come to the realization of the Yogataras. Now, remember, Varahamihira lived in the 6th century AD. That was about 1400 years ago. What happens? As time goes by, you know, the Yogataras got murkier and murkier, and people really didn't know where they were. It's not until like recent Western academia started studying and comparing the mentions of the Vedic astrology with the mentions of Arab and Chinese astrology that they start decoding, because some of the books I cited give different locations for the stars. Now you have to remember, these books do not call the stars by their name. They call them by their coordinates, and sometimes they are the same, sometimes they are not. And they became more and more clear in the last 200 years, more or less. And, you know, I recommend you read the Surya Siddhanta, the version that was written in 1860 by Reverend Ebenezer Burgess or Borges. It's a really good book. It's a really good book, and you get a lot of interesting stuff about the nakshatras from, you know, 150 years ago, more or less. It's a really good edition of the Surya Siddhanta. But the thing is that now with modern Vedic astrology in the last 50 years, since astrology and astronomy has completely divided, has completely been divorced, you know, a lot of astrologers have no idea about the Yogataras for the nakshatras. And I would dare to say that the great majority do not have any idea of what stars relate to what nakshatras. Why? Because, you know, you read the books that have been written in English about nakshatras, specifically, you know, the Dennis Harness book, which was more or less the first one in US, the Prash Trivedi books, the Robert Svoboda and Hard to Foe book, obviously also the Dr. Pai, Big Dekara books, which are more recent. Also, to a certain degree, you know, Bepin Bihari, Dr. Frawley, and even Michael Reed's videos, and to a certain degree also KRS videos. You know, people seldom talk about the stars. in the way I'm talking about them now. They talk about the stars and the importance of the stars, but you won't usually find somebody say, well, Aldebaran relates to Rohini because it's a royal star and it's the Oculus Tauri and it's in Taurus, and Yeshta alludes to Antares, which is basically the rival of Mars. You won't listen to that. You won't read that because they don't, the majority of astrologers don't care about astronomy, and they usually do not read the classics, right? And I don't mean that in a mean way. It's basically something that I've come to notice as I've been learning and growing in the field of Jyotisha. And you won't see in these books references to the Surya Siddhanta, basically because Surya Siddhanta has to do a lot with numbers. And I'm not saying I'm a person who got into the numbers. I just read the commentary. But the idea is that you won't see these references. And if you see the reference to the stars, you will see that these modern books tend to give different stars, or they kind of vary a little bit. And they seldom say, this star alludes to this nakshatra because Surya Siddhanta sets it so, and so on and so forth. And if you're interested, I think if I'm not mistaken, in terms of the reference in the Surya Siddhanta, you can look it up, if I'm not mistaken, in chapter 7, where you will see all the allusions to the nakshatras in terms of this astronomical opus in terms of Vedic astrology. So there you have it. The Yogataras basically became solidified by the 6th century AD. Now, what happened before that? I don't know. There's a probability that the nakshatras could have been tropical. There is a probability that the nakshatras started someplace else, like in Kritika. There's a probability that they even started in Mula. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do not know about nakshatras, mainly because they became solidified after Varaha Mihira in the 6th century AD. And we're going to see this with Abhijit, because I don't know if you know this, but in Muslim astrology and Chinese astrology, there are 28 mansions, not 27. So there you have it, a brief introduction to this map, to the points. And let's start our journey finally with each of the nakshatras. So we're going to go to another graphic, and we're going to go to my Facebook page. So here we have the Surya Siddhanta that I was reading just now. So let's go to my Facebook page, and these are basically images I created with the Yogataras. Now, if you remember the last map, you will see that I identified each Yogatara by a point. But usually, Yogataras are identified by one or several stars in the firmament. So you will see Yogataras that are 1 star, like Chitra, like Swati. You will see Yogataras that are 2 stars, like Ashwini. And you will see cases that they're 9, like Mula. And we're going to see this little by little. So basically, we're going to start with Ashwini. And Ashwini is represented by 2 stars north of the ecliptic in the constellation of Aries. Now, before we start, I also want to say that sometimes the stars will allude to a certain degree either to the symbol or either to some sort of folklore associated to the nakshatra, but sometimes they won't. And we're going to see that stars are either south of the ecliptic or north of the ecliptic. So as I said, Ashwini is represented by 2 stars, Alpha Arietis, Beta Arietis, which are the modern day terms for these stars. And they are called Hamal and Cheratan, which are obviously Muslim names or Arab names. Now, Ashwini is in Aries. And as I was reading, there is a certain debate, because some authors said it was Beta Arietis and others say it's Alpha Arietis. But the majority of astrologers today say it's both of these stars. Hamal is basically the head of the ram of Aries. And Cheratan alludes to the 2 signs. Basically, this was the star where in ancient times the vernal equinox occurred, right? And we see that there are references to vernal equinoxes in a lot of nakshatras. Obviously, now the vernal equinox in the beginning of the 21st century is in Pisces, but in the past was in Aries, and in a further past, it was in Kritika. Okay? So basically, that's where you have it. Some people say that these 2 stars might allude to the idea of the 2 horses, of the symbol of Ashwini. So there you have it, Ashwini. So let's move on. Now we have, There we go. Now we have Barony, and Barony is represented by 3 stars. The Yogatara is 3 stars north of the ecliptic, and they are 39 Aries, 35 Arietis, and 41 Arietis. Now, in modern astronomical in nomenclature, stars, first of all, stars are divided into 88 official constellations, as I said before, and each of these quadrants, which are asymmetrical, some are big, some are small, some are medium size, you first start naming all the stars in that quadrant using the Greek letters. And once they run out, you use numbers. And usually the Greek letters allude to the brightest stars within the constellation, and the numbers allude to fainter stars. And as you can see, the stars that allude to Barony are quite faint. You can see these stars in a medium dark sky, but in reality, if you live in a big city, it's going to be kind of hard to see them, but you got to know where to look. And at the same time, we see these form a triangle, which can allude to a certain degree to the symbol of Barony, which is basically the female yoni, or the female reproductive organs of, the uterus and the vagina, which is usually, from an alchemical perspective, seen through the inverse triangle, which alludes to the element of water. Okay? So let's move on. Now we have Kritika, which is represented by a cluster of stars north of the ecliptic in the constellation of Taurus. And Kritika is alluded to the Pleiades. And the Pleiades is a very famous cluster of stars. It is a Messier object, which is basically a list of objects that astronomers look at, that was created by a French astronomer in the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And Kritika is very interesting because it's one of the most easily recognizable stars or cluster of stars in the skies. And you will read a lot of references to the Pleiades throughout different cultures throughout time. Now, from the Vedic perspective, the Pleiades are basically the 7 or the 6 wives of the Saptarishis, which are represented by Ursa Major, more north of the ecliptic. There's a wife that is in Ursa Major, but these 6 stayed behind. But there are a lot of stories within it. Now, from the Hellenistic perspective, these are 7 goddesses from the god of the ocean. Now, there are different stories. I remember one, I don't remember from what culture it was, but it's the idea that if you had vision problems during the night, they will tell you how many stars you would see in the Pleiades. And if you said 6, you had perfect sight. And if you said 4, 3, you were blind like an owl, and you didn't have glasses because back then glasses didn't exist. So yeah, that's a very funny story. It's basically like the chart of the numbers and the letters you have today in ophthalmologist offices and so on and so forth. But as you can see, a very famous stars north of the ecliptic. Okay, so now we move on to Rohini, and Rohini is alluded in a Yogatara by one Yogatara south of the ecliptic, and it's called Aldebaran. And Aldebaran is a very interesting star because it's a very important star. It's a Bohemian star, just like Kritika is, although Kritika is a cluster of stars, but it's a Bohemian star, which is a list of important stars within Muslim astrology. And Aldebaran is the a Muslim name, which the scientific modern name is Alpha Tauri. And basically, this star was also known as Oculus Tauri, or the Eye of the Bull. Not the Eye of the Tiger, it's the Eye of the Bull. And basically, this is where the Eye of the Bull of the constellation of Taurus was. Now, you see a bigger green circle. That alludes to the idea that some astrologers allude more to the constellation of the Iades than to Aldebaran itself as the Yogatara for Rohini. But I prefer Aldebaran, since Aldebaran is a very important star. It's one of the royal stars. It's the guardian of the East. And there are 4 royal stars. We're going to see that the Yogataras in Vedic astrology use 3. Aldebaran for Rohini, Maga for Regulus for Maga, and Antares for Yeshta. Okay? And Aldebaran in Arabic means followers. And it means the idea that Aldebaran is following Kritika. And here comes the idea that in ancient times, Kritika was the first lunar mansion. Because probably a lot of thousands of years ago, when astrology started to take hold upon the human psyche, the vernal equinox occurred in Kritika and not necessarily in Aries or in Pisces, like today, obviously. So basically, you have there Aldebaran, Very famous star, very bright star. You can see this star very easily in the night sky. Now we move on towards Migashira, and this is very important star. First of all, Migashira is alluded by a Yogatara composed of 3 stars south of the ecliptic, Phi 1 Orionis, Phi 2 Orionis, and Lambda Orionis. And the very important thing about this is that this is the first Yogatara that we're going to see that alludes to a constellation that is not one of the 12 sidereal constellations. And it's not either one of the 13 astronomical constellations, because you will see that sidereal Vedic astrologers will usually say that the Nakshatras construct the Rashis. But that's not necessarily true, because you will see a lot of Yogataras that are not part of the 12 the 12 sidereal constellations. We will see this with the Bhadrapadas. We will see this later on with Ashlesha. We will see this with several Yogataras. And it starts here with Migashira from the order of Ashwini. Now you have these 3 stars, and these 3 stars allude to the head of the hunter Orion, which to a certain degree also alludes to the idea of the head of the deer, which is a symbol for Migashira. Now, I made a green circle over Bellatrix because Prash Trivedi says that this usually is also used as a pointer for Migashira, because the stars of Phi 1 and Phi 2 and Lambda Orionis are not so easily seen at night. So you look easily at Bellatrix and then you can find it. So here you see an example where the constellation holds some resemblance to the nakshatra symbol. And before, Oculus Tauri, the eye of the bull, we have to remember that the symbol for Rohini is a cart, which is usually, or at least in ancient times, pulled by a bull. And Kritika is a sword or a knife that cuts. And basically, Kritika is basically here alludes to the idea of cutting, cutting the mansions and starting something and ending something, being the ancient first lunar mansion. And by the way, if you look at Parashara, in the first part of Parashara Horashastra, you will see that they usually start the nakshatras counting from Ashwini, usually using the notes. But in the second volume of Parashara, you will start seeing that Parashara starts naming the nakshatras by Kritika, and specifically the Vimshottari time systems by the sun that alludes to the Trikona of Kritika. So, this is another way of figuring out that Parashara Horashastra is a book that has been tempered with to a certain degree. And obviously before that, you have Jama, which is the god of death of barony, which it's the second nakshatra, but having this idea that Kritika was the ancient first one, now it makes sense that the Lord of Death was the deity of the last ancient nakshatra, okay? And it's also the idea of how these stars are very faint to a certain degree, and how Kritika is like very visible, very easily observable in the night sky. So afterwards, I'm going to tell you a little story about these stars. And then after Migashira, we go on to Ardra. And once again, Ardra is south of the ecliptic and is represented by 1 star in the constellation of Orion, which once again does not form part of the 12 sidereal constellations. Now, Ardra is represented by Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse is a very famous star right now as we are recording this video, because modern astronomers think that there are at least 3 stars in the night sky that will go supernova sometime. And one of them is Betelgeuse. Betelgeuse is a huge star. Like, its circumference is from the center of the sun till the orbit of Jupiter, or at least the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. But the idea is that Betelgeuse fluctuates in terms of its luminosity. And it grows, it dims, it grows, it dims. And, some people say it's going to go supernova, but soon. But when they say soon, they mean in the next thousands of years. But the thing is that since Betelgeuse is like 80 light years away, if it explodes, we have to wait 80 years till the light gets here. So basically you have that there. And it's very funny that this alludes to Ardra, which is its deity is Arudra, which is the god war of Shiva. So basically you have it there. And at the same time, it's the armpit of the hunter of Orion, which also has some sort of bellicose war-like resemblance to the intensity that Ardra usually carries. And then we have Castor and Pollux, which are very famous stars, which allude to Punarvasu. Now we're going back to the 12 sidereal constellations, going back to Gemini by two stars, Alpha and Beta Geminorum, which are the traditional names for these two stars, which are in the constellation of Gemini, that allude to the famous Hellenistic twins, from which, Mituna has its, or at least Gemini has its symbol for the twins. Because we have to remember that within Vedic astrology, Mituna they're not twins. It's basically like a pair, a wife and a husband. The husband has a mace and the wife has a lyre. So before we go on, I want to tell you a little story that goes on with these stars, for those that know the deities and everything like that. As you know, Rohini is the favorite wife of the moon. She's a beautiful woman, but what happens? And let me tell you the story. The story is that Rasheeda was Brahma, and he was infatuated with Rohini. He wanted to have her, but they were family, so it was kind of incestuous. So, the gods didn't like this. They found that a little bit scandalous. So what happened? Arudra, Shiva, the god of war, noticed this, and he wanted to do something about it. He wanted to stop Brahma from getting Rohini. So what did he do? He took some of his arrows, which is the symbol for Punarvasu, the quiver of arrows. He took some arrows, then he pulled on his bow, which basically is more or less where the armpit of Orion is, and then he shot some stars, and he beheaded Brahma. And he beheaded the head of Orion, the head of the deer, so he couldn't get Rohini. So basically, there you have it, right? And, another thing that it's important to say before we move on is that Ardra is basically the opposite direction of the center of the galaxy. So if we wanted to go away from our galaxy, if we were in the Star Trek ship Enterprise and we wanted to get away from this galaxy, the closest way out would be a straight line towards Betelgeuse, okay? So basically we have that story. We went over Punarvasu, which is a quiver of arrows. And as you can see, you see the resemblance of the constellation to the little persons holding hands. Well, that is the allusion to the twins, or to the wife or the man and the woman in the Mituna allusion in Vedic astrology. So we move on to Pushya. Now, Pushya is kind of hard to see in the night sky, and at the same time is a star that has several Yogatara allusions. I also have to say that Ardra was also another one that had several Yogatara allusions. But Pushya is kind of difficult to see. People say it's Acellus Borealis, Acellus Australis. And as you can see, there are others in terms of Theta Cancri and Eta Cancri, and the Beehive cluster, which is another Messier object. So basically, you see here that there are a couple of stars very close to the ecliptic, both south, north, and in the semi-ecliptic that allude to Pushya. Now, Pushya is kind of difficult to see. What I've noticed is that fixed signs, specifically Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio, have a lot of Yogataras, but Aquarius does not have it. Now, cardinal signs, specifically Capricorn, has no Yogataras, and at the same time, Libra and Cancer have Yogataras, but they're a little bit difficult to see. They're kind of dim stars. Aries is the exception, where you have basically two Yogataras that we already went through, which was Bharani and Ashwini. But basically, Pushya, you have it there. And, there are different allusions. I chose these because, in a way, you kind of see a cow otter. And actually, you read that. You read that the cluster represents a cow otter, but usually they gave 3 stars. And last time I checked, a cow otter has 4 teeth, not 3. And by the way, yes, that is the correct zoological term, the biological term for the pieces in an otter. So basically, I chose these 4, but more or less, they're more or less in the same degree. So there's not a lot of difference. So moving on, we move to Ashlesha. And Ashlesha is very interesting because Ashlesha is represented by 6 stars. And they're south of the ecliptic. And once again, we are in a constellation that does not form part of the 12 sidereal constellations. And it's even more interesting than that. Ashlesha forms part of the Hydra constellation, which is the longest constellation. It's really long. It's south of the ecliptic, and it's below It's below Cancer and Leo, and it goes all the way to Libra, almost Scorpio. And basically, it's just a snake. It's Hydra, and it's not the organization from Captain America and the Marvel movies. It's basically a sea snake that holds some resemblance to the deity of Uttara Bhadrapada, which is a sea snake also. But the idea here is that Ashlesha is a snake and Hydra is a sea snake within the Hellenistic mythology. Now, some people say that the circle is like a coiled snake, but in essence, this is the head of the snake of Hydra. And Ashlesha forms one of the three unofficial pairs of the Nakshatras. There are three official pairs and three unofficial pairs. And this is the first unofficial pair, which I allude to Ashlesha and Maga. Ashlesha being the snake, Maga being the lion, Ashlesha being the mundane, Maga being the holy or the royal, Ashlesha being the things that are dirty to the ground, Leo being or Maga being the idea of what's up and high. But you see, the allusion of the snake and the lion, or at least the snake, is very old. You will see Egyptian references to Hydra where the Sphinx is stepping on the snake. So basically, Ashlesha is a snake, and some people say it's a coiled snake within Vedic astrology, but it's basically the head of Hydra, which is the head of the snake. Now, Maga is basically Regulus and Leo. So basically, you see here, Maga, the Yogatara for Maga is basically several stars, but it's basically Regulus, which is another royal star. Regulus in Latin means the little prince. And basically, this is the frontal feet and the head of the lion. And it's basically like an inverted interrogation sign. And it's basically stepping over Hydra. That's why it alludes to it. And we have to remember that, Leo, Regulus, Maga alludes to things that are highly. Remember that Maga's symbol is a palantir, or basically like a throne that you hold up on the shoulders of many men. But basically, you have the idea here of the P-tier, of the ancestors that allude to like the ancestors of royal houses that have the royal decree to rule over what is earthly and mundane, which you have the snake there. So there you have it. We go once again up in the ecliptic and back to the 12 sidereal signs. And we're going to see that Leo has 3 Yogataras. Then we go to the Falgunis. You have 2 stars there, which are basically north of the ecliptic, which are basically Delta and Theta Leonis. And then you have 93 Leonis and Benevola, which is basically Beta Leonis. And basically, we're going to see, here is the first official pair, the Falgunis. And what I've noticed, and this is conjecture, first of all, the Purva Falgunis allude to the middle part of the lion of Leo, and the Uttara Falgunis allude to the tail and the back legs of the lion. Now, what I've noticed is that when you have trapezoids or like rectangle figures in terms of the Yogataras, you will see for some reason the illusion of a bet symbol. You will see this with the Falgunis, you will see this with the Bhadrapadas, and you will also see this with the Uttara Ashada. And basically, I've come to the conclusion that when you have Yogataras that form like a rectangle, and with the Bhadrapadas, you will see it, when they kind of form like a trapezoid figure, like for some reason the symbol for the bed comes up because you have 4 poles. Obviously, the Falguni allusion is like a bed or a divan, while the Bhadrapadas is basically a funeral cut where you put a body to rest before you cremate it. But basically, you have the Yogataras for Purva Falguni and Uttara Falguni north of the ecliptic in the constellation of Leo. Now, we move on to Hasta. Hasta is south of the ecliptic in the constellation of the Crow. Now, in Vedic times, this constellation was not a crow. It was seen as a hand. And basically, that's where you get the symbol for Hasta, a hand, because the constellation of Hasta was a hand to ancient rishis. But once again, we have a constellation that's not one of the 12 official sidereal constellations, south of the ecliptic. Then we move on to Chitra. Beautiful Chitra is represented by Spica, slightly south of the ecliptic in the constellation of Virgo, the Virgin, or Kanja. And Chitra holds a very special place both for tropicalists and siderealists. Why? Because this is called Alpha Virginis, one of the most important stars in Virgo. And basically, Chitra holds a special place for siderealists because the majority of Vedic astrologers, of Jyotishis today, unconsciously or not, use Lahiri Ayanamsha in their practice. And Lahiri Ayanamsha is measured or arranged through an Ayanamsha that's really called Chitrapaksha Ayanamsha. The thing is that after Indian independence, it became Lahiri Ayanamsha because of a bureaucratic decision. But the idea is that Chitrapaksha Ayanamsha was the original name of this very old Ayanamsha. And it uses the star Spica or Chitra to arrange the sidereal zodiac. And that's why it's very important for siderealists. For tropicalists, it's also important because the precession of the equinoxes was discovered or rediscovered by Hipparchus of Nicaea in the 2nd century AD. And although nobody knows, this is a hypothesis, he figured out the precession because he figured out that certain stars had moved from ancient records he was verifying. As you know, stars more or less move by themselves a little bit every 50 years, but the vernal equinox changes 1 degree every 72 years or so more or less. So basically, some people say that he studied Spica as the star that proved that he concluded that the vernal equinox was moving in contrast to the fixed stars. And there you have the precession of the equinoxes that didn't really take hold until 400 years later in the 2nd century AD with Ptolemy, right? So basically, Spica has that. Spica alludes also to wheat, and it also alludes to the symbol of Virgo to a certain degree. It also alludes to a certain degree to the idea of how it lusters, how wheat is so important for food. And this basically also alludes to the Kanja symbolism of a girl in a boat with a flame, like how do you call that? Oh my God. Antorcha, like a flame, and she also has like wheat, which also alludes to the idea of the trophy of Chitra that's usually represented by a pearl or by some sort of precious gem. Then we move very, very, very north of the ecliptic to Swati, which is represented by Arcturus, which is in the constellation of Bhutas, which is not part of the 12 sidereal constellations. This is the northernmost star in the Yoga Tara scheme for the Nakshatras, without counting Abhijit. But within the 27 star scheme, it is the northernmost. It's very interesting because within Hellenistic astrology, it is considered like the star of friends, but Swati is sometimes considered like a loner to a certain degree, just like Shatabishak to a certain degree. But I also, for me, Swati natives are very existentialist to a certain degree. But there you have it. You know, that's the idea of the Yoga Tara. The symbol for Swati is sometimes like a gust of wind, which maybe alludes to the idea that the wind goes up and Swati is very up in the ecliptic. So we move on. Now we go to Vishaka once again in a cardinal sign. These stars are not easily seen in the night sky. Now, basically, Libra is Vishaka. Almost all of the stars of Libra, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and also Jota Librae are part of this scheme. Now, the ancient Arab names are Suben el-Genubi, Suben el-Shamali, and Suben el-Hakra. Why? These names allude to parts of the scorpion. Now, most people who practice Vedic astrology are unaware that in ancient times there existed 10 zodiacal signs. Very back in time. Now, the newest constellation, to my understanding, the newest sign is Libra, according to the writings of Manly P. Hall and other astrologers I've talked to. And basically what they did with Libra is that they took a little bit from Scorpio, a little bit of Virgo, and they created Libra, like a balance. And that's where the idea of the balance comes in. And that's why Muslims have the names of Scorpio here for the stars of Libra. Although, you know, the Muslims usually extend their stars and their constellations more than the official Hellenistic versions. So basically you have Vishaka, which forms the first part of the second unofficial pair with Anurada. It's very interesting because Anurada and Vishaka, their symbol are doorways. Now, what do they lead to? Or at least their symbols are arches. Where do these lead, these arches? Well, I believe it leads to a certain degree to Mula, as we're going to see later on. But that is very interesting. You know, you have, and by the way, these stars are north and south of the ecliptic. With Anurada, we come to Scorpio Constellation, and basically you have 3 stars, Pi Scorpionis, the Shuba, and Akrab. Akrab is north of the ecliptic, and the other 2 are south. Basically, this is like the head of the Scorpio, and it forms that pair with Vishaka. Anurada basically means coming after Vishaka. So basically you have that, and they form a doorway to the last of the Nakshatras, the eldest one, which is Yeshta. It's very interesting because some people say this was the last Nakshatra to a certain degree, but I think that does not relate to an order specifically, but the idea that it comes before Mula. As we're going to see, Mula is very important. And Yeshta Yogataras are south of the ecliptic. They're basically Sigma Scorpionis, Antares, and Taurus Scorpionis. And Antares is the 3rd of the royal stars. Basically, she's the guardian of the west. And Antares in ancient Greek, what it means is the enemy of Mars. Ares is Mars in Greek. Antares is the enemy of Mars. Because Antares looks a lot like Mars, and when Mars is more or less here, they resemble each other a lot. And basically, you know, the qualities of Scorpio, of Mars, of Jeshta, of Indra, more or less have all similar qualities of rashness, of being bashful, of being, you know, jumping before looking, that sort of idea. But basically, this was called the Ancient One. And it was, it's sometimes in Nakshatra lore, it is compared as the least favorable wife of the moon because it's 180 degrees of Ardra. And then we have Mula, which is a very important Yogatara, because Mula in Sanskrit means root. And it means going to the root of things. And even though we have 9 stars for Mula, the important thing is the circle that it creates, right? Because basically, this circle points the way to the center of our galaxy, which is basically like the center of our stellar neighborhood or of our local neighborhood. And basically, if we were going to the center of the galaxy and we took a starship, the fastest way to go would be a straight line towards this circle of the Yogatara of Mula, where we will see the center of the galaxy. So basically, that's what Mula's Yogatara is important, because it resembles the center of the galaxy. And some people say that with these Yogatara, you basically construct the Mula Trikona scheme in Vedic astrology, the idea of having the Trikona houses with the fire signs, you know, having, Sagittarius, Aries, Leo, that would be the Mula Trikonas of Jupiter, Mars, and the Sun. And then you have the Trishadayas from there, which would be 3 Aquarius, 6 Taurus, and 10 and 11 Virgo and Libra, that would allude to the Mula Trikonas of Saturn, the Moon, Mercury, and Venus, respectively. So there you have it. And another thing that siderealists are going to find a little bit surprising is that Mula is in the constellation of Scorpio and not in the constellation of Sagittarius. Now, it's very important to say that the point in the tail of the Scorpio is also the point of the arrow of Sagittarius. And basically, we have here, by the way, the stars in Mula were south of the ecliptic. Now here we have the stars for Purva Ashada. They're south of the ecliptic, and they're called Caus Australis, Caus Media, and Caus Borealis, which allude to the bow of the archer of the centaur of Sagittarius. Now, Purva Ashada is represented sometimes by a hand fan, but I prefer the elephant tusk. I prefer to allude the symbol to the official pairs to be the same one. For me, Purva Ashada is one tusk, and Uttara Ashada is another tusk. I don't like to separate the symbols, not to confuse the students. But basically, you see here like a triangle of a tusk that maybe alludes to a tusk of an elephant, but it also might allude to the idea of a hand fan. Now, Uttara Ashada is also a tusk, but it can also, once again, resemble a bed, because you have 4 stars, although some astrologers also only use Nunki and Acela. Some use Tau, Sagittari, and some use Phi Sagittaris. The idea of the bed frames comes once again from the idea of having a parallelogram or a trapezoid figure in terms of the arrangement of the stars. But basically, I prefer a tusk. And once again, these stars are in the constellation of Sagittarius. So they are in the sidereal constellations that allude to the sidereal zodiac. But starting from Shravana and starting even from Dhanishta, I've always noticed that from here on, the Yogataras kind of get weird because they don't go to Capricorn, they don't go to the shiny stars in Aquarius, and in Revati, it's very sloppy in Revati, as you're going to see. But from here on, it's kind of murky, to be honest. But, let's continue. In terms of the Yogataras, in my experience. So basically, Shravana is alluded by 3 Yogataras north of the ecliptic. And this is basically the constellation of Aquilae, of the eagle. And it's represented by Altair, which is Alpha Aquilae. And this is another instance where we have a Yogatara that alludes to the symbol of Shravana, because Shravana is usually represented by an ear or by a trident, but it's usually represented by 3 steps that took the Vishnu Avatara that was the dwarf, the midget. What was it called? Varaha? I don't know. No. Vamana? I'm sorry for all the Vaishnavas that are watching. I forget. But the idea is that the 3 steps that cover the whole world are represented by the 3 stars of Shravana. And Shravana forms part of the 3rd unofficial pair, which is Shravana with Dhanishta or Shravishta, or the most famous one. Shravana and Dhanishta are an unofficial pair because they allude to hearing and like sonic stuff in terms of sonic waves of hearing and listening. And Dhanishta is alluded once again by stars north of the ecliptic that do not form part of the 12 sidereal constellations. This is the constellation of Delphinus, which is basically the constellation of the dolphin. And, these 2 nakshatras, Yogataras, are north of the ecliptic. And basically, you just jumped all the stars that compose Capricorn, which once again allude to the idea that maybe, the zodiacal signs are more of an Hellenistic nature, and the Yogataras and Nakshatras are more of a Vedic context, okay? Now we move to Shatabishak or Shatabishaka. We go back to the sidereal constellations, this times in Aquarius, which is one of the 12 sidereal constellations. Now, the Yogatara for Shatabisha is 1 star, is called Sadashvya. And look at the resemblance between the Vedic, the Sanskrit name, and the Muslim name. Now, this is very interesting because here we have the 4th royal star, more or less, which would be Fomalhaut. But the ancient rishis did not choose Fomalhaut for Shatabishak. They chose Sadashvya. They already chose Aldebaran for Rohini. They chose Regulus for Maga, and they chose Antares for Jeshta. But they didn't choose Fomalhaut for Shatabishak. Why? I don't know. But they chose Sadashvya, which is not that bright of a star. It's Gamma Aquarii. So basically, there are 2 brighter stars in Aquarius than this one. In Muslim astrology, it is a very good stars to set up camping. So for those who like camping, use Sadashvya for electional astrology. And another interesting fact that I want to mention, Shatabishak alludes to the 100 doctors. And some astrologers mistakenly said that Shatabishak is represented by 100 stars in the sky. But as you can see, we can barely see at least 6 or 7. So this is not the case. Obviously, you could see 100 stars with a telescope at any place in the horoscope, in the firmament, I mean. But it's just 1 star, okay? And then we move to the Bhadrapadas, which once again is not part of the 12 sidereal constellations. In the Bhadrapadas, we once again have a trapezoid figure. Purva Bhadrapada, 2 stars, which are basically Alpha Pegasi and Beta Pegasi north of the ecliptic. And then we have Uttara Bhadrapada, which is represented by Gamma Pegasi and Delta Pegasi, but since 1930 is Alpha Andromeda. We're going to talk about that. But look at this. This is a perfect square. This is the so-called square of Pegasus, which alludes to the 3rd official pair of the Bhadrapadas. And once again, the Bhadrapada is alluded to a sort of bed, a funerary cut, where you put a cadaver to burn it and cremate it according to Vedic tradition. Now, this is a perfect square. This is, once again, in a constellation that is not part of the 12 sidereal constellations, a perfect square, and they form a parallelogram or a trapezoid, alluding to the bed symbolism, once again, within the nakshatra lore. Now, Purva Bhadrapada has another symbol, which is like the two-faced god, like Janus, the god of doors in Hellenistic times. And to a certain degree, I sometimes sense that Purva Bhadrapada and Uttara Bhadrapada are like twins because of their Yogataras and how they're aligned. It's just a conjecture of mine. But basically, there's another important thing about Uttara Bhadrapada. Uttara Bhadrapada is the only Yogatara in the Nakshatra scheme which is represented by two stars that are in two different constellations from the modern perspective. As I said before, traditionally, the square of Pegasus was composed of Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta Pegasus. But since 1930, Delta Pegasi became Alpha Andromedae. So Uttara Bhadrapada is represented by Gamma Pegasi and Alpha Andromedae, being the only one of the Yogataras that are alluded by two stars from two different constellations. Now, finally, Revati. Revati is a mess. I've always noticed this, and through my studies, people become very murky and very sloppy with Revati. First of all, you read the natal astrology, representations of Revati, and they're basically a copy-paste of Pisces. The symbol for Revati is a copy-paste of Pisces. And at the same time, sometimes you will see astrologers that say that Revati is represented by 32 stars, which allude to the constellation of Pisces, which I think is ridiculous because Pisces is huge. It's much larger than 13 degrees. So it does not make sense to do that. Some say it's 16, but you basically stick with this and you're going to be okay with Zeta Pisces, which is one star that is basically in the same ecliptic. So basically you have there the 27 Yogataras, but wait, there's more. We have to talk about Abhijit. Abhijit has a lot of things going on. It's not that it's not used. It's not that it doesn't count. The thing is that there are two systems. There is a system of 27 stars and there's a system of 28 stars. You have to remember that Chinese astrology and Muslim astrology use 28 constellations or lunar mansions, and Vedic astrology uses 27 nakshatras, but it also uses 28. And let me explain. Some people are not going to like this, but this is my conclusion from what I've studied. But the idea here is the following. A sidereal month takes 27.3 days. So basically you create 27 equal spaces, right? As I have understood, in the early Middle Ages, specifically the 6th century AD, there was a debate between astrologers of what was going to be the prime system of timing for Vedic astrology, if it was going to be Ashtotari or if it was going to be Bimshotari. And obviously Bimshotari won. And what happens? Bimshotari is a lunar time system scheme that depends upon 27 stars with 108 padas and 9 planetary heralds. Before we move on, I want to emphasize the following. It is incorrect to say that planets rule over or reign over nakshatras. That is incorrect. Planets rule over signs. I advocate the use of the term herald, which was coined by my colleague Michael Reed for the nakshatras, because planets get associated to certain nakshatras depending on the time system you're using. And Bimshotari became king. And for Bimshotari Dasha, you need 27 nakshatras with 9 planetary heralds and 108 padas to have that perfect mala system, right? So they took out Abhijit. Why did they took out Abhijit? They took it out because it's a very northern star. It's very north of the ecliptic. And at the same time, Abhijit is a circumpolar star. What does this mean? What this means is that Abhijit in an ancient past was a polar star. It represented the celestial North Pole. But now Polaris is the polar star. And eventually in the future, in thousands of years, according to the precession of the equinox, Abhijit will become once again a polar star. And I believe it just was taken out because it was out of the system. It was very northwardly. It made common sense, the idea that let's take this out to make this perfect system of 27 stars with 108 padas and 9 planetary heralds. And we have to sacrifice one. So we're going to take out Abhijit. So does that mean we will never use Abhijit? No. What that means is that you got to read the second volume of Rihad Parashara Hora Shastra. And you have to read the second volume. I have the Santanam edition, which the second volume was translated by G.S. Kapoor. But basically go to chapter 46, where you will see that Parashara gives 10 lunar time systems for timing. Okay? And the most famous one is Vimshottari. Yes, he dedicates most of its time to it. He will dedicate subsequent chapters to its explanation. Although he says that Kala Chakra is more important, but that's another topic for another video. But the idea here is that he gives 10 lunar systems. Some of them use 9 planets, some of them use 8 planets, and some of them use 7 planets. Some of them use 27 nakshatras, and some of them use 28 nakshatras. Now, what are those systems? Well, guess. It's Ashtotari, which is a system of 28 nakshatras with 8 planetary heralds, and the other one is Sashtiyayani, which is 69 years, which applies only when the sun is in Lagna. Ashtotari depends if it's a night or day birth, and you have to look at the moon and the sun. Now, these 10 time periods do not apply for everyone. There has to be some certain astronomical arrangements, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But Abhijit will be present in the Ashtotari system of 108 years, and it will be present in the Shashtiyayani. My belief is that the debate over Ashtotari or Vimshottari came over the 108 number. It was the idea, oh, we got to put the 108. Are we going to put it in padas, or are we going to put it in years? And decided upon padas. So basically, just to have an example, first of all, I recommend you read the second volume. And just to give you an idea of how planetary heraldship changes from time system to time system, you know, in the Ashtotari Dasha system, the sun rules over Ardra, Punarvasu, Pushya, Shlesha. The moon rules over Maga, Purva, Falguni, Uttara, Falguni. Mars rules over Hasta, Shitra, Swati, Vishaka. Mercury rules over Anurada, Yeshta, Mula. Saturn rules over Purva, Shada, Uttara, Shada, Abhijit, and Shravana. Abhijit, there you go, Saturn. Jupiter rules over Danisha, Shada, Vishaka, Purva, Bhadrapada. Rahu rules over Uttara, Bhadrapada, Revati, Shvini, and Bharani. And Venus rules over Kritika, Rohini, and Migrashira. As you can see, Ketu has been taken out. In some time system, they take Ketu out, and others they take Rahu out. In one, they take Venus out, and in others, they take the nodes out, both of them. So basically, you have it there. You use Abhijit in these 2 time systems. But they do not apply for everyone. Only Vimshottari applies for everyone. And that's why a lot of Vedic astrologers think that Vimshottari is the only time system. That is why some astrologers use the term rulership over the nakshatras with the planets. And that's why some astrologers commit the error of saying that, for example, Ashwini relates to Ketu. And they use Ketu to explain Ashwini. They use Venus to explain Bharani. They use Sun to explain Kritika. And that is incorrect, completely incorrect, because you gotta use the scheme. Yes, the Sun will relate to Kritika, Venus will relate to Bharani, and Ketu will relate to Ashwini only within the Vimshottari sign system of 120 years. Okay, so there you have it. Okay, that's the difference between the 27 and the 28 nakshatra system. Another thing, Abhijit is used in muhurtas or electional astrology, and it is placed between Uttara, Shada, and Shravana, and it is also a light nakshatra. So basically, you would use this nakshatra as a positive placement for B.B. Raman said in his book, like, to decorate your house, that sort of thing. But, you know, Abhijit has certain qualities like other nakshatras. It is a light nakshatra. It also has some allusions to the phonetics within the nakshatras. As you know, certain nakshatras allude to certain phonetic sounds. But as I have understood, Abhijit does not have a Joni. Abhijit does not have a Veda dosha. You know, it doesn't have a lot of other things because these were things that were strictly developed within the Vinshatari sign systems, which gives you a clue that they were developed further on in the tradition. Now, another thing that I want to say before we end is that Abhijit Muhurta is one thing, Abhijit Nakshatra is another. Do not confuse them. Yes, Abhijit Nakshatra, you use them in Muhurtas, but Abhijit Muhurta is not the same. Abhijit means the one that cannot be vanquished, the one that is always victorious, just like the Asharas, which comes before Abhijit in terms of the Nakshatra screen for Muhurtas. So Abhijit is a word that is recycled a lot because it means, you know, the unvictorious. And Abhijit Muhurta is basically 28 minutes before and after midnight, before and after midday, which is a very auspicious moment to do things. Now, in India, as I have understood, I'm not Indian, I don't live in India, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a custom to get married at midday to maximize the idea of this Abhijit Muhurta, which is basically a timing technique that will bring you victory and you will not be vanquished. You will be Abhijit, right? But Abhijit Nakshatra is one thing, Abhijit Muhurta is another. And, you know, there's also like a reference in, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, the Mahabharata, specifically in the Gita, where Krishna says, I am, you know, the Abhijit, but he probably means the unvanquished one, right? Because if you read old books, if you read that version of the Surya Siddhanta I told you about, the Reverend Ebenezer Burgess, you will see that he alludes Brahma to Abhijit. So basically, Brahma would be more of a traditional deity for Abhijit, just like Prajati is for Migrashia. So there you have it. Oh my God, this was a very long video. Oh my God, I'm sorry if I bored you, but there you have it. This was the video for the Yoga Taras, the astronomy of the Nakshatras. I hope you liked it. If you have any comments, any questions, feel free to write them down. I'll try to answer them. At the same time, you know, you can go to my website, fernandoraulastrology.com, where you can see all my readings. It's in Spanish, but I'll probably change it to English when I have the money. And, you know, if you want to know more about me, you know, subscribe to my channel. There you have a lot of videos. They're in Spanish, but I hope that eventually YouTube has an algorithm where it can translate the videos with English subtitles automatically. So, as I say always, I wish you all the best, and I wish you all serenity, strength, and wisdom. Take care and go out and watch the stars. Take care. And if you don't have a telescope, don't worry. Buy one of the apps. I have, what's the name of my one? Sky Guide. It's like $2, $5. Download it. You are not going to regret it. It's excellent. You know, discover the stars. Go out. Watch the stars if you're going to do astrology. Take care.